Okay, let's dive right into this explainer with a pretty shocking quote from Time magazine in 1979 when they named their person of the year. They wrote, "As the leader of Iran's revolution, he gave the 20th century world a frightening lesson in the shattering power of irrationality. The revolution that he led to triumph threatens to upset the world balance of power." Now, Time magazine doesn't just hand that title out for benign accomplishments, right? They give it to the person who has most impacted the globe, for better or worse. And this quote just perfectly captures the massive, absolute shockwave caused by one single man. So welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to neutrally examine the fascinating and honestly, highly complex historical record of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. We're going to trace exactly how a quiet, ascetic religious scholar became the architect of a revolution that overthrew a centuries-old monarchy and established a modern theocracy. It's a story that completely, fundamentally rewired the geopolitics of the Middle East. Let's start at the beginning. Section 1, The Making of a Cleric. Born in 1900 into a family of well-established Muslim clerics and scholars in Persia, Khomeini's early worldview was shaped by some seriously deep study. By the time he was just 6 or 7 years old, he was already diving into the Quran, Arabic texts, and Persian poetry. To understand his political moves later on, we really have to define his religious framework: 12-verse Shia Islam. This is the dominant branch of Shia Islam, and they believe there were 12 legitimate imams following the Prophet Muhammad. Crucially, though, they believe the 12th imam is concealed or hidden and is basically waiting to return at the end of time. And you'll see how this deeply ingrained theological perspective heavily dictated his frameworks for how a modern state should be governed. As Khomeini grew into a prominent scholar in the 1920s and 30s, the guy developed a very distinct reputation. He was incredibly aesthetic, he lived really plainly in his dress and his diet, he was scrupulously punctual, highly methodical, and strictly adhered to Islamic ritual purification. He studied everything from ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle to the great Persian philosopher Avicenna. And this sets up a stark contrast, right? Think about typical 20th century revolutionary leaders. Almost without fail, they became corrupt millionaires. Khomeini, by contrast, lived this famously modest, uncorruptible lifestyle that earned him massive respect among his followers. Moving on to Chapter 2, Exile and Rebellion. So how exactly does a quiet scholar turn into a revolutionary? Well, it came down to a massive ideological friction. On one hand, you had the Shah's White Revolution. This was an aggressive program of secular modernization aimed at redistributing land, increasing literacy, and breaking the power of old feudal and clerical elites. It was highly pro-Western and brought considerable wealth to the country. But against this, you had Khomeini's fiercely opposing vision, Islamic government. Khomeini organized a fierce boycott of these secular reforms, viewing them as completely anti-Islamic and illegitimate. Instead, he called for a theocratic state overseen by clerics, implementing Sharia law. Khomeini's vocal opposition to the Shah naturally led to his arrest and ultimately his exile in 1964. But while Khomeini spent 14 years in exile, bouncing from Turkey to Iraq and eventually France, anger back home was boiling over. A major reason for this public hatred was Savak, the Shah's brutal secret police force. Savak was responsible for detaining, torturing, often using electrical cables, and killing hundreds, potentially thousands of political dissidents. The aloofness of the Shah's regime, combined with this terrifying, constant repression, provided very fertile ground for Khomeini's message, which he was actually broadcasting back into Iran via radio from exile. Things escalated with rapid, bloody intensity in the late 1970s. In October 1977, Khomeini's son Mustafa died mysteriously in Iraq, a death the Iranian public largely blamed on Savak. Then, in August 1978, a horrific fire at the Cinema Rex killed nearly 500 people. Though it was likely started by extremists, the public immediately blamed the government. This sparked massive protests, which the Shah met with martial law, and the Jala Square massacre in September 1978, where hundreds were killed or injured. By October, Khomeini was expelled from Iraq and ended up directing the final stages of the revolution from the suburbs of Paris, where he could easily use international media to broadcast his messages straight back home. Which brings us to Chapter 3, the 1979 Revolution. By December 1978, the Shah's government was terminal. The military literally refused to keep fighting the massive protests. On January 16, 1979, suffering from failing health and a completely collapsing state, the Shah fled Iran permanently. Just over 2 weeks later, on February 1st, Ayatollah Khomeini triumphantly returned from 14 years in exile on a chartered Boeing 747. Millions of Iranians flooded the streets of Tehran to welcome him back. But it's important to clarify something the historical record shows. The revolution wasn't entirely homogeneous. Once the Shah was gone, a chaotic power struggle kicked off.
On one side, you had secular revolutionaries who had fought the Shah and really wanted a secular, democratic republic. On the flip side, you had religious clerics demanding a strict theocracy. Ultimately, Khomeini and his clerical allies won this tense battle to define what the new state would actually look like. And the result of that victory was a highly paradoxical new constitution, adopted by referendum in December 1979. It basically created a hybrid theocratic and democratic state. It featured Western-style democratic elements, like an elected president and parliament. It even guaranteed rights for women. But, and here is the massive catch, only if those rights were in conformity with Islamic criteria. And most importantly, it officially established Khomeini as the supreme leader of Iran for life.
All right, Chapter 4, The Supreme Leader. 444 days. That is exactly how long 53 Americans were held hostage in Tehran by radical students who seized the U.S. Embassy in November 1979. This was a shocking international crisis that permanently, to this day, severed diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran. Domestically, however, it successfully radicalized the revolution even further and completely consolidated Khomeini's unquestionable authority. Almost overnight, the diplomatic map of the Middle East was rewired. Think about it. Pre-1979, under the Shah, Iran was a firm U.S. ally in the Cold War and even had relatively cordial ties with Israel. Post-1979, under Khomeini, Iran completely severed U.S. relations, became deeply hostile to Israel, pushed into a neutral, non-aligned movement, and made its primary foreign policy goal the promotion of a unified Islamic world completely free from both Western and communist influence. But Khomeini's dream of Islamic unity was pretty quickly overshadowed by war. 500,000. That is the devastating estimated human death toll of the Iran-Iraq War. In 1980, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, hoping to capitalize on the post-revolution instability. Well, he was met with fierce, coordinated Iranian resistance. It turned into an incredibly bitter 8-year conflict, marked by literal trench warfare and Iraq's horrific use of chemical weapons. It cost Iran an estimated $500 billion and completely defined Khomeini's reign. Now, while that war raged externally, strict control was enforced internally. The Islamic Republic imposed Sharia law. Western fashions were aggressively clamped down upon. There was severe repression of religious minorities like the Baha'is, who were deemed heretical, as well as ethnic minorities like the Kurds. And alongside this repression grew a pervasive cult of personality. Khomeini was actually granted the semi-prophetic title of Imam, and public spaces across Iran were completely blanketed with his imagery. We're talking a personality cult rivaling Mao or Castro. And finally, Chapter 5, A Lasting, Complex Legacy. The final year of Khomeini's life was highly controversial. In July 1988, just as the Iran-Iraq War was ending, a series of mass executions swept through Iranian prisons. They targeted left-wing groups and regime opponents, with death tolls estimated anywhere from 2,000 up to 30,000 people. Then, in February 1989, he issued his infamous fatwa against British-American author Salman Rushdie over his book The Satanic Verses. Just months later, in June 1989, Ayatollah Khomeini died at the age of 89. And the reaction to his death truly illustrates the fanatical devotion of his followers. Roughly 10 million mourners, that's about 1/6 of the entire population of Iran at the time, attended his state funeral. The grief was so intense, it actually resulted in a frantic stampede that broke open his wooden coffin, as desperate mourners ripped pieces of his burial shroud to keep as holy relics. It was a chaotic, unbelievable farewell to a man who had completely transformed a nation. So why does all of this matter today? Well, the history we've just mapped out traces straight into the present. Decades after his death, Iran remains a gerontocracy, ruled by aging leaders from that exact 1979 revolutionary era. The ongoing Cold War with Saudi Arabia, the prominence of militant groups like Hezbollah and Lebanon, and the perpetual looming standoff with the United States and Israel, all of these trace their direct origins straight back to the policies instituted by Khomeini's Islamic Republic in 1979. Yet, there is a really stark demographic irony at play right now. Iran's population has boomed from 36 million in 1978 to 90 million today, and the average age is just 30 years old. That means the vast majority of Iranian citizens weren't even alive for the 1979 revolution. This massive generational divide has sparked widespread, intense protests in recent years against the strict rules of the morality police, signaling a youthful population that's chafing under a system built nearly a half-century ago. All of which leaves us with a pretty provocative question. Looking at the history we've just covered, was Ayatollah Khomeini a legitimate revolutionary who overthrew the brutal, torturous regime of the Shah? Or was he ultimately the architect of a repressive theocracy that simply replaced one form of tyranny with another? It is an incredibly complex legacy that absolutely continues to shape our world today. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.